Denver, and in this video we're going to discuss the Bikini Body Nutritional Calculator. So typically with online coaching, the traditional form of online coaching that I offer, my clients will sign up and I'll review their consultation form and I'll give them a personalized nutrition plan with food that they like, and a calorie amount and macronutrient amount that I feel is probably most effective towards their goals. And from there, every week they email me, they fill out a review, and based on their results and their consistency, we look at nutritional adjustments to ensure that they keep progressing. A lot of the time it comes down to more behavioral coaching, helping people to be a bit more consistent, and coming up with strategies to improve consistency, more so than having to change the nutritional macros. But sometimes we change macros not because we need to, but just because it's the most comfortable way to get a result. So that's something to consider as well. But anyway, so that's the standard way of coaching. But with this group coaching, what we have instead is a nutritional calculator. So you girls are able to change your macros based on your progress yourself. So this gives you a little bit more of self-assessment, a bit more empowerment in a sense, because you're able to really decide what your intake will be. And in a sense, plugging your numbers into this program that I've designed, this Excel spreadsheet, it will give you a bit more clarity in regards to how low your macros could get, and what your limit might be in terms of how low you'll potentially eat, and also some adjustments you can make based on personal preference, which is pretty awesome. So the way that the template is designed is, when I give you your macronutrient targets at the start of this program, you're going to put it into any one of these gray blocks. So you've got one here for that database, and then you've got one here, 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 and here. So the 5 areas that we look at is the first one, which is losing too slow. So I've given you your macronutrient targets, you've been consistent for 1 week, maybe 2 weeks, and you're not really seeing the fat loss that you really want, or the weight change that you really want. Because for the most part, it's not always ideal, but typically we use a scale as one of the guides to track progress. And just touching on that, some great ways to track progress is the scale, measurements, photos, and strength and performance. They're 4 good indicators of progress. So that's the 4 areas that we typically look at. But in most cases, when you want a bikini body, you want to see your weight going down. So we've got a little structure right here. So if you're losing too slow, you're losing less than 300 grams per week. And just touching on that, ideally we want to lose between 0.5 and 1% of your total body weight. So if you weigh 60 kilos as your total weight, you want to lose between 0.5 to 1% of that 60 kilos, which would be 300 grams to 600 grams per week. 300 grams is on the lower end, 600 grams is on the upper end, and somewhere in between, if you're within that range, you're losing at a decent rate. Now, that sounds simple, but that is actually a result of consistency, being on point with your macros, being on point with your training, etc. So 0.5 to 1% doesn't sound like much. It sounds like quite easy, losing 300 grams on the scale or 600 grams or whatever. But there are definitely some weeks where you may not see any changes at all, and you might consider reducing your macros, or be a bit concerned. The first thing we always have to look at is your consistency. So how consistent are you really? Are you really hitting your numbers? Are you on point? Are you consistent? You're not dropping weight, but are you visually improving? Because that might be a consideration for you to just keep your macros where they are. Is your strength better? Your health? Your relationship with food? A lot of things to consider before you say, hey, you know what, this isn't working, I'm going to change it. So this one where it says losing weight too slow, less than 300 grams per week, that's just a very simple way of ensuring, or leaning towards fat loss at a steady progressive rate. But if you feel like you're improving and you don't need to make any changes, great, we don't make any changes at all. But anyways, let's just assume that I gave you 185 grams of carbs and I gave you 135 grams of protein, and we went with 55 grams of fat. So they're your initial macros, and they equate to 1,775 calories. If after 2 weeks you feel that you aren't progressing, and typically I would prefer it to be 2 weeks rather than 1 week, although in the first week there's going to be a lot of room for trying to be consistent, learning flexible dieting, learning how to track your macros properly, so there's a lot of room for error. So we don't like to make changes in the first week, but leading into the second week, if you aren't seeing, or the end of the second week I should say, if you aren't seeing the changes that you'd like to your physique and how you feel and everything else, you can look at that first decrease, so decrease number 1, and that's going to essentially just pull your carbs down by a certain percentage. It's going to keep your protein the same, and it's going to pull your fat down a little bit as well. And that's going to pull your calories down to around 100 calorie drop or thereabouts, a little bit more. So you're going to run with that for 2 weeks or longer. Stay with it for as long as you can. If you're no longer seeing the results you want on the scale, your training's good, you're doing your conditioning work, you're doing everything you need to do, you're hitting your macros, not happy, want to see better results, don't want to do more training, let's look at decrease number 2, and then you keep pulling down. So if you look across the board, there's 6 decrease options over 12 weeks, which is more than you need, but they're just there just so you can understand how things would progress based on your progress and results. If you decided to start at your current macros and go straight to decrease number 2, that would be a little bit more of an obvious drop, and that might be okay in some circumstances, but rather than do that, we'd rather just go with decrease 1 for a week and then go to number 2, go to number 3, and then all the way to the end you'll see that the limit is 1114 calories in that on that scale, so from 1700 down to 1100. So we don't really want to go below 1100, and just so you know, you don't really want to have anything less in general. You don't want to have anything less than 10 calories per pound of body weight that you are. So let's assume that you are 60 kilos, and I'm just going to bring up the calculator again, like I have done in previous videos. We're going to go, you are 60 kilos, and 60 kilos times 2.2 will give you your weight in pounds. So you weigh 132 pounds. Times that by 10, and that gives you 1320 calories. So if you weigh 60 kilos, it would be highly recommended that you try to avoid going below 1320, which you'll see that would situate around decrease number between number 4 and number 5. So we don't really want to have to get down there, but if we do, and we do get past that amount, and you weigh 60 kilos as the example that I've used, you don't want to go below 1100, because if you are at that intake and you are 60 kilos, you're probably not consistent with your training, you're probably tracking macros incorrectly or using the wrong nutrient information, and just small things like that that you just don't realize. So that's just something to note. But anyway, so that's losing too slow. So that's the biggest graph, because that's the most generalized one that we typically would use if people want to just push things a little bit harder. Okay, so let's go to the next one. You're losing way too fast, so you have low energy, strength loss, always hungry, always thinking about Nutella, not able to actually measure and track that Nutella. You want to have more, greater with a greater urge than you typically would or would like to have. Then we look at increasing your macros to suit. So again, we put in 185 grams of carbs, 135 grams of protein, and 55 grams of fat, which is 1775. And it's going to give you an increase to 1867 with majority of calories going to carbohydrate and a small amount added to fat. If that's not good anymore and you're still very hungry, losing weight too fast, you're not happy with things, you can go again to increase number 2. And it's not, a lot of this is based on metabolic function, but also your activity level. Some of you girls might be extremely active, and others may have a desk job, and some of you may also be extremely active one day and not so active the next day. So your energy expenditure, the amount of calories you burn through your daily activity, could really fluctuate between all of you girls, or just yourself on a weekly basis or even on a daily basis, which can really make changes to what the ideal macros or macronutrient intake is for you. But we don't want to make changes on a daily basis. We just want to be consistent, and based on a week's results, then we make changes based on that. So that's for losing too fast. And then we've got the next one, which is rapidly gaining weight. So if I've given you your macros and you're a week or two into it, and for some reason you've put on 3 kilos and you're trying to lose 3 kilos or 4 kilos or 5 kilos, that's a problem, right? So we want to fix that. And to do that, once again, we put in your macro numbers, which is 185, 135 protein, and 55 fat. And it's going to give you an option number 1, which is going to reduce your carbs by around 20% or so. It's going to be a nice little drop. So you're going to be eating about 80% of what you were previously, and it's going to drop your fat down a little bit more. and that's going to give you a nice calorie reduction, which is definitely going to help you to lose weight. And then you've got option 2, which is a smaller drop as well, or a bigger drop as well, which is just a little bit lower than option number 1. Now, if you look at if you're rapidly gaining weight and you're on these macros, and then if you look at the option number 1, which sits you at 1582, that's very similar to going straight to a decrease at number 2 over here on this scale. So if you're rapidly gaining weight, you're basically going straight to that decrease number 2 rather than going to that decrease number 1. So you're saving a bit of time. So that's how I've set it up. So there's no real time wasting. If you're really heading in the wrong direction, we get you straight back on track as soon as we can. And then option number 2, 1508, is closer to decrease number 3. Which is another big push ahead. So if you're rapidly gaining weight, you can choose option 1 or option 2. I'm definitely going to recommend option 1 first and then consider number 2. But in most cases, you can go straight to option 1. Okay, so now we're going to look at a reduced carb option. So let's just say I've given you your macros, but for some reason you don't seem to like carbohydrates. You don't tolerate carbs very well. And sorry about the bird right now that he's making noise. But anyway, you don't tolerate carbs very well in your own opinion, so you prefer to have a higher fat intake. You're probably not as active, or you feel like you just perform better, and it's a personal opinion, and that's perfectly fine. We're going to put in your macros right here, because what matters most is your calorie intake. Your calorie intake will determine whether you gain weight or lose weight, more so than whether your macros are certain percentage or ratio or number. What matters most in the goal of fat loss is sufficient protein, resistance training, and then being in a calorie deficit. So eating fewer calories than you burn, which will result in weight loss. So the distribution of carbs to fats isn't too much of an important thing to consider. We just like to play with carbs the most because it's that one macronutrient that will really determine whether your energy is great and your training is great and everything feels good or not. And we're going to be following this program, so we really want to be ensuring that your energy is good and you're not really restricted at all as well. So a high fat diet typically means low carbs or lower carbs, which could sometimes mean restrictions in terms of food choices, which could result in increased hunger or cravings or things like that. But anyway, so with your reduced carb option, we got your current macros right here, just the same as all of them. And you've got option 1, which drops your carbs by a decent amount and increases your fat, but your calories are the same. Or you've got option 2, which really drops your carbs and increases your fat, and your calories are the same again. So that is so I can give you a macro straight up, and you can say, hey, you know what, I don't want these carbs, I don't want these fats, I'm going to switch it up. You can go straight to the reduced carb option, chuck in your current macros. Don't touch the calorie number, just kind of leave that where it is, because that's got a formula attached to it. But just change this and the calories will change by itself. And then you can choose whichever one you prefer. In either way, whether you choose option 1 or option 2, you're going to get the same result in terms of calorie intake and protein intake, which is great. If you did choose a higher fat, lower carb option, you may drop a bit of fluid, water retention, and feel like you've dropped weight, body fat, but it's not. It's just water, unfortunately. I'm sorry. So, sometimes you might feel like you're winning because you're on high fat, low carb, but overall you could be losing because your energy might not be as good. And the last option we have is a refeed option. So the refeed option is basically an increase in calories coming from carbohydrates, and that can be done once or twice per week based on your progress. So let's just say hypothetically, I'm going to chuck these numbers in first before I go ahead and talk about that. So we got 185, 135, and 55. Let's just say hypothetically you are losing weight too fast, right? So you choose to go to increase number 1. You're on increase number 1 and you're still losing weight a little bit faster than you'd like, and the goal is fat loss, right? The goal is to have a bikini body, but it's affecting you in terms of low energy and a little bit of strength loss, or just not feeling your best. To try to combat that but still get great results in terms of weight loss, you can go over to the refeed option and you can decide to do a medium day every 3rd day, or you could do a medium day every 4th day. Alternatively, you could do 2 refeeds per week, where you have a medium day on a Wednesday and a high day on a Sunday or a Saturday or something like that. So they're spread apart. And what that means is 2 days per week you're actually having a higher calorie intake or macronutrient intake than what I've prescribed you. But in a sense, it's helping you to maintain energy strength, happiness, and it's a nice little bump in the middle of your week and on your weekend to just have a little bit of a diet break in a sense, which is kind of what a refeed option is. So you'll see that the refeed option, the protein stays the same across the board, whether you choose medium or high. The calories jump up by around 100 calories and then around 200 calories or 300 or so on the high day, and it's predominantly from carbohydrate. And with the medium and the high, your fat intake comes down a bit. And that's just because when you have a refeed is supposed to improve some physiological metabolic function, and it's kind of hit and miss for the most part. But a refeed is based around carbohydrate. So there's hormones that are regulated by carbohydrate intake. So the more carbs you have, the better you're going to get in terms of metabolic function and fat loss, basically. And that's why we use carbohydrate more than anything else. If you have a higher fat intake on a refeed day, it's going to do very little, pretty much nothing, in comparison in regards to improving metabolic function and reducing adaptation and stuff like that. So the refeed is completely optional. I like to include those when I do personalized nutrition plans as well, just so people think that or feel like they've got a bit of an option to, eat a little bit more food, but it is controlled. It's always controlled. And at the end of the day, having an extra 100 calories once or twice a week isn't going to really hurt you, and it can definitely help you. So that's what the refeed option is for. So that is pretty much it. That's your Bikini Body Nutritional Calculator. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask, but I feel like I have covered everything.